Hello, my name is Beto. I teach linguistics and anthropology at the Federal University of Sergipe, Universidade Federal de Sergipe, in Brazil. And I'd like to thank the easst organization and the coordinators of this session, Arthur, Veronica, and Ruben, for the opportunity to participate in this conversation. And I apologize for not being able to participate in person and for all the problems I had at the last minute. So I will present a short video with the part that I found most interesting of my initial proposal. And for that, I try to be as objective as possible. My English isn't very good. I'm reading here. My voice is terrible because I'm coming out of a bad cold. I'm still in it. And maybe you hear some strange noises during the recording produced by Pepe. Come here. But my 7-year-old son, who could be anywhere in the house right now, is here. Oh,
Hello, my name is Shard.
okay, so
Yeah! Hello, my name is Becky. Yeah!
let's go back. What I propose here is it's a brief reflection on what I call social drift, or conservation of the coontogenic niche in the relational space of language. The term social drift is the social counterpart of natural drift, the explanatory path of evolution proposed in 1992 by Chilean biologists Humberto Maturana and Jorge Podoses in a small book originally written in Spanish and translated into English in the year 2000 in the form of a paper. Perhaps it is good to say right away that distinguishing between natural and social drift has nothing to do at all with the nature and culture or nature and society divide. On the contrary, the natural drift of Maturana and Podoses is as relevant to the establishment of socialities and the cultural life of organisms, including humans, or only humans if you want, as the social drift that I proposed here, based on the model of Maturana and Podoses, is fundamentally a biological phenomenon. I'll come back to the Maturana and Podoses theory shortly. First, I want to say two things about the concept of drift and how it operates in my proposal. Whether acting on evolution, ontogeny, or development, or behavior as a property of dynamic systems, that is, of systems that undergo structural change, obviously in a temporal dimension, drift does not only refer to change, but also to conservation. And it is this aspect which I want to privilege here, not only because of the tendency in linear approach to consider conservation a non-phenomenon, that's it, what does not happen, but because of its crucial importance in the interactional processes of organisms. In evolution, this should be obvious, but neo-Darwinian biology and natural selection obscure this aspect of evolution. As the text by Maturana and Podoses makes clear, without the conservation of ways of life in reproduction, there is no constitution of lineage. This idea has a vague parallel with Steve Gould's motto of punctuated equilibrium, stasis is data, with the difference that in that frame, one thinks of morphological stability within a lineage in geological time, whereas the issue here is the possibility itself of distinguishing a lineage through conservation. In the dynamics of ontogeny, conservation processes are directly linked to the business of living, that is, to the organism's continuous acting and knowing in structural coupling with the medium, which, according to the systems theory I'm using here, presuppose the conservation of adaptation and the conservation of organization of the living system in question. Adaptation in the systems approach I use here is invariant. To live is to preserve adaptation in the course of living. and not to adapt to a pre-existing medium. Uh, and here, the relationship between conservation and behavior is also implicit. It is behavior, the relationship established between organism and medium, that guides the path of change and conservation of the organism itself, changing or conserving at the same time its ontogenic niche. The conservation of an ontogenic phenotype, an organism in its niche in the course of living, is carried out in the living of the organism. It is an operation in a behavior domain. The second point about the concept of drift, last but not least, in fact, it should be the first, is precisely the concept of drift. I will use an image used by Maturana, aware that I do not have the same narrative skills of this Chilean biologist. So let's try it. Imagine that you are on a boat adrift at the sea, and luckily you have a radio, and you call the Coast Guard. They ask, do you have oars? No, I don't. Got sails? No. Is there an engine of some sort and a wheel to steer the boat like Mickey in his steamboat? There is not, so you have no control. You are adrift. But the curious thing is that you don't have control, but your boat doesn't go in any direction. It's not random. You just don't know which way you are going. And anyway, it's not up to you to decide which way to go. In the case in question, for example, there are sea currents. In fact, the Coast Guard might tell you, give me your coordinates, and we'll rescue at point A or point B, as your boat will be there in about half an hour, for example. An interesting example is the simulations which can be found on the internet of sea currents like this one in the Atlantic, which I found on YouTube. It is curious that in the caption of the simulation, it is said that it is part of a project to build an autonomous boat to cross the Atlantic, an autonomous boat. That is, the definition of autonomous for the boat is a boat without a pilot, in person or remotely. A boat that sails with Gaia, so to speak. In some detail, these currents were well known in the 15th century Portuguese navigators, and probably others before them, and Captain Ahab used them to hunt and ultimately be hunted by Moby Dick, which unfortunately was not the fate of European settlers. Sorry for that. What remains to be known about drift is how and if it can be configured as an explanatory path, a generative model, an explanation, in short, of historical process, especially relational process involving organism. It is necessary to return to the natural drift of Maturana and Podoses, which, as I said, is a small book or a paper, but is not an easy text. I've been trying to ruminate on this text for some years now, with double success, and I wouldn't pretend that in a few minutes I could summarize or even offer a schematic view. I will instead clarify some concepts, and I invite you to read the text itself, which I can send you by mail in both languages. The book is this one. The crucial point is the understanding, followed by the authors of Natural Drift, and which I follow in my proposal of social drift, that living systems are structurally determined autopoietic systems that exist as such only as long as their operations and interactions maintain their organization and their operational congruence with the circumstances in which they live. Thus, all biological phenomena, including those that occur in domains of supra-individual relationships, such as reproduction, social relationships, and symbiosis, have to be explained and understood, taking into account what happens to living beings during the process of their realizations as individuals, who maintain their organization and adaptation as conditions of their existence. What I have just outlined is the explanatory path of the so-called biology of knowing, or School of Santiago, founded by Maturana and Varela in the 1980s. These are scandalous statements because they challenge convictions deeply rooted in both the biological and social science. And it is also a very poorly understood conceptual framework, which is excusable given the volume of assumptions put in suspension and suspicion. But it is necessary to mention this. An important example is that of Dana Haraway, who is somewhat following Latour and Stengers in a discussion of the concept of autopoiesis in Lynn Margulis, which is already a source of confusion of its own. I'm not going to talk about so Haraway confused autopoiesis with a deterministic system based on the notion of control and prediction of states, impermeable to interaction and yet as a model of self-organization. But this could not be because organization is an operation of is a distinction operation of the observer. So an organism cannot self-organize itself. This is a typical confusion between biological and epistemological explanations, which I will just have time to mention here. Autopoiesis means self-production. Thus, the definition of a cell as a system of molecular productions that, in its structural dynamics, produces itself is a biological statement, but the definition of a living being based on its particular autopoietic organization is an epistemological statement. That is to say that once I distinguish a system, everything that happens to that system depends on the structure of the system, not on information from outside or from one of its parts. A system cannot be instructed, otherwise it changes its class. It becomes something else, another system. Just as King Midas could not be a chemist, everything he touched on the periodic table turned to gold. This is the idea of structural determinism. Structural determinism is not genetic determinism or environment determinism or any other reductionist or control notion or predictive notion. It is the claim that any structural change a system undergoes are determined by its structure at that time. In the case of living beings, this opened an avenue for talking about conservation and change. Living beings not only change, but more than that, they need to change in order to maintain their class identity and their congruence with the environment. When a living being stops changing structurally, it is no longer a living being, it's something else. And the notion of structural determinism breaks with the notion of a representation of the world, of the environment, of reality, if you want. And on the other hand, breaks with the notion of genetic information, the reductionist notion that ontogeny is guided by information contained in a master molecule. Organisms preserve and change their ways of life through behavior, their incessant and coupled encounters with the medium, conserving their organization and adaptation. But how does the organism do this? In the flow of its living, a living system does not accommodate itself to the medium. It just operates in its closed structural dynamics, and when it does so, it creates a niche that continually resurfaces. Hence drift, not natural selection, is Maturana and Podosi's explanatory model for evolution. What biologists connote as natural selection, in spite of its historical and discursive weight, is the result of historical process, not their explanation. In the case of evolution, lineages are lineages, a population, a particular species of a large taxonomic group, precisely because biological reproduction is a systemic process of conservation of a particular ontogenic phenotype, ontogenic niche relationship, not of some genetic condition. In the ontogenesis of a living being, although there is systemic conservation of the initial structure, anything that occurs appears epigenetically, and it is not possible to say that the structural characteristics that arise in ontogenesis are genetically determined. It is behavior, not genetics, that is the central factor that guides the course of the history of living systems. This structural determination with change and conservation in epigenesis has a name, drift. And just as in evolution, the interactional process of organisms, from their chance encounters to, if they are recurrent and recursive, the establishment of social systems and symbioses, are also guided by conduct, by behavior. In particular, the formation of social systems, uh, inter or multi-species, from the historical emergence of insect colonies to primate societies and to interspecific socialities, for example, those that occur in certain domestication process, as the historical relationships between humans and wolves, or in falconry, the crucial space is that of language, or, if you prefer, the establishment of a linguistic domain. What is it? It is the domain of conduct coordinations, behavior coordinations, of coontogenic relationships in which the structural dance of two or more organisms are recurrent and recursive and serve as a reciprocal niche. That is, in which the space of interactions itself becomes the coontogenic niche in which autopoiesis and the adaptation of the organisms that participate in the dance are preserved. A space that is established when it is established, and that lasts as long as it lasts. Adrift. Thank you very much. I also want to thank all the participants of this session, and also my son that was playing along while I'm doing this recording. Thank you.